like to introduce our visiting author today, Emily Friedland. Friedland brings her debut novel, History of Wolves, which is a gripping coming-of-age story that takes place in northern Minnesota. History of Wolves won the American Academy of Arts and Letters Sue Kaufman Prize for First Fiction and the Great Lakes Colleges Association New Writers Award. It was also a finalist for the Man Booker Prize for Fiction, the Penn Robert W. Bingham Prize for Debut Fiction, and the International Dublin Literary Award. Please join me in welcoming Emily Friedland.
Welcome. It's so good to see you all here. Thank you, Paige. Thank you, Kate. Thank you, all of you who've supported this reading series. It's such a pleasure to come back to Minnesota. I'm living in upstate New York now, and I rarely get back in mid-November, right? So it's been kind of fun to be here on this gray day. My little 2-year-old is out testing ice to see how thick it is with my parents. So early winter, which seems appropriate for this book, which has a kind of wintry feel. History of Wolves. I'm going to read a little bit. We're going to have a conversation and then open up to questions, I think. I thought I would read today just a short fragment. This book has a narrator at its heart that drew me in as a writer. This is a character who I always found interesting and complex and sometimes difficult. And a lot of that has to do with her position. She's a teenager growing up in this remote place in northern Minnesota. She was raised in a back-to-the-land style commune that broke up when she was really little. And she finds her life is, her really insular life is punctured by the arrival of this family that moves in across the lake from where she lives. And she becomes a babysitter for their little boy, Paul, who's 4. And I was thinking a lot about babysitters. I was a babysitter, like many teenage girls and probably teenage boys too. And I was also reading, right before I wrote this book, some of those old great governess stories, if you can imagine, The Turn of the Screw, Jane Eyre, and I was thinking about how these books have a narrator at the heart of them who's both a part of things, an intimate part of the families where they work, and also kind of kept at a distance from the secrets that are happening within that family. And that's the weird role that babysitters play, right? They're kind of a part of a family, but also outside of the family, an employee. And so I wanted to read a passage that kind of gets at some of that. Linda, also known in this book as Madeline or Maddie, is babysitting this kid and increasingly realizes that something is not quite right in this family, the Gardner family across the lake, but can't quite put her finger on what that is. And so I think the scene kind of plays with that a little bit. All you need to know is the husband, Leo, is gone, out of town, doing research in Hawaii. He's an astronomer. And Linda is over at the Gardner's house having dinner with Patra, the mother, and Paul, the little boy. There was one night in particular. Paul was whiny, and Patra was casting about for something other than trains and bath time to talk about. I remember how she pushed back her bowl, set her chin in her palm, and pointed herself at me. "Okay, Linda," she said. There was something unsettled about her that night, a frenzy of tiny movements in the skin around her eyes. "Tell me, you're one of those girls who wants to raise horses or something, be a vet, when she grows up. I can tell. I'm right, aren't I? That's what you want to be. I wasn't one of those girls, actually. I didn't think much about the future, but when I did, all I could come up with was the weird image of a semi-truck, white and floating down the highway. Of course I couldn't say that. I couldn't say truck driver. So to stall, I looked across the table at Paul, who was inching from his chair to the floor, singing, I want to be a physicist. I want to be a physicist. Patra was just teasing, though, I could tell. She didn't really care what I said as long as I played along. She wanted something to do before clearing the table, before coaxing Paul towards bed, a distraction before the husband called. I could be a vet, I said, offering myself up. Sure. Or no. Patra pulled one bent leg under her. I've got something better for you. I'm good at this kind of thing. Let's see, you, Linda, you deserve something you haven't seen. A city to explore, you know? A bunch of people trying to get in your doors. You should be... She snapped her fingers, flashing a grin. A hotelier, a restaurateur. She looked so pleased. A restaurateur? Paul asked. I grunted to keep from smiling. Like a waitress? I did that already. I swept my hand across the room like, what's all this then? I quit for you. She widened her eyes, feigned shock. You left the restaurant business to be a babysitter? That's a whole lot of pressure for us here, isn't it, Paul? We should give you a better title then. Where did the word babysitter come from, anyway? I shrugged. An ugly word, right? Should we call you nanny instead? No, that sounds like an old lady. What about governess? Ooh, let's call you governess. She was laughing now. That's so much better. A babysitter would never be hired for Flora and Miles. You've read The Turn of the Screw? Or a babysitter couldn't fall in love with Mr. Rochester, right? And be the heroine? Governess, you are. Governess, Paul shouted from under the table. He waited for Patra to define it, and when she didn't, he pulled a fist of pebbles from his stash in the glove and threw them. Watch it, I told him. To Patra, I don't know, I'm not so sure. Sounds like kind of a sissy thing to be. Plus, people will think you're like millionaires or something. I was trying to keep from grinning at her. You're right, Patra pouted. Time for my bath. Paul pouted too. He crawled from the floor onto her lap. Patra let him nestle into her chest while she stroked his hair. She patted his cheek, but her eyes were on me. You're right, Linda, you're right. People here already think I'm a snob or something, an anomaly. She furrowed her brow, following a new train of thought. I'm still figuring this place out, what's what. It's funny, I've been to the diner with Paul 4, maybe 5 times for lunch. I see the same people every time I go in. They all look at me. They all smile and say hi, but no one has asked me one thing about myself. Not my name, not a thing. People are nice in a way, but also not, I said. She pulled Paul's hand away from the buttons on her shirt, so he took up her hair instead, winding his fingers in her blonde curls. Was it a good idea to come here? She asked me now. The idea was that while Leo was in Hawaii this spring, we'd come out to the new summer house, go somewhere quiet and nice, just me and Paul as a kind of hideout. A hideout from what? She spun her free hand around in a general way. You on the run, I teased. You rob a bank over there in Illinois. Ha ha ha, she said. Paul was yanking on her hair, not hard, but slowly and repeatedly. If so, no one cares too much what you do here, so long as you keep to yourself, I joked, and don't, take all the good fishing spots. I winced at how lame a line it was. But that didn't keep me from trying again. And as long as you're not something really unforgivable, like divorced or an atheist or something, gentle, hon. Petra was prying open Paul's fingers, pulling out her hair. Or, Paul, stop. She scooted him at last off her lap, patting his rump to offset that burst of irritation in her voice. Go get your puzzle, bucko. Let's do the owl puzzle. How about? When he'd left, she started stacking plates and bowls, making noise, moving quickly. Then she sat down again, suddenly. I really don't know if it's a great thing for us, all this quiet. Why did I think it would be a good thing for us? Maybe it would be better for Paul to go back to preschool, to be around people who, maybe it wasn't such a good idea to come here in the first place. She looked up at me then, and there was something I didn't expect in her eyes. It's still a pretty good idea, I said, unsettled by her guilty expression. I'll leave it there.
Oh, welcome everyone. I'm Paige Reel from the English department, and I'm so glad that you're here. I want to thank you all for coming, and also I want to thank all of the students who submitted questions for Emily Friedland, and we're going to spend some time asking some of those questions. And if we don't get to yours, or you think of another question as we're going, please be ready because we will have time for questions from the audience. So we're really happy to have Emily Friedland here for our 20-year anniversary of the Two Rivers Reading Series, so welcome.
Thank you so much.
So I love that opening scene that you read from that gives us a sense of the young protagonist, Linda. And a lot of students asked if there was anything from your own life that inspired the character of Linda. And they were also very interested if you thought she was reliable.
Right, from my own life. So in some ways, Linda's really different from me in a lot of ways. I didn't grow up in northern Minnesota in a small town. I grew up in the Twin Cities. I didn't grow up in a commune that had come apart. That being said, I was a teenager, of course, and I've always been really, really interested in that kind of the adolescent perspective, the way in which teenagers can be incredibly canny, incredibly observant, can know a lot, but also in a lot of ways you don't know a lot because of their limited life experience, and that's all the more the case for Linda, who has grown up in this really isolated place and in this really isolated way, and so she's like incredibly canny, and also somewhat ignorant for a long time about it, and has a hard time figuring out ways to interpret what she's seeing that's happening right in front of her. So that's just always been really interesting to me. I like that perspective, and so in that way, Linda, I guess, is she's sort of like she draws from my experience as a kid growing up, as a girl growing up, but her unique circumstance sort of exaggerates that sense of knowing and not knowing at the same time. That I think a lot of adolescents, a lot of teenagers feel. Reliability, that's the second part of the question.
Yeah, is she an unreliable narrator?
Yeah, oh gosh, that's a hard question. Because the easy answer is to say, yes, she is unreliable. But I guess it's my belief that all of us are, on some fundamental level, unreliable narrators, in the sense that none of us are capable of seeing everything, and so we have limitations. And so as a writer, for me, what's interesting to explore is the ways in which those limitations work on particular voices or particular narrators. So I would say for Linda, like I said, in some ways she sees more than other people in this book. There are moments when she really is able to point out something about Leo, the father, for instance, or about Mr. Grierson. She's able to see something happening with this teacher that long before it comes up that he is accused of possessing child pornography, she kind of senses something in him. She's a really good observer, and that makes her reliable, in a sense.
In a sense. And so You also have a unique way of looking at Linda and presenting Linda at different times in her life. So you have kind of a non-linear narrative here. And I was wondering how you wrote the book. Immediately, did you know, well, I'm going to jump around in time so that we're seeing Linda in those years when she's a teenager, and then also when she's, the age that Patra was and the age that Leo was?
Yeah.
And how was that constructing the book? Was that challenging?
Yeah, so the book began as a short story. That first chapter was initially kind of a self-contained little piece that I wrote. And I finished it and put it away and thought I would be done. And this voice and this place were just really interesting and resonant with me, and so I went back to them eventually. If you remember at the end of the first, for those of you who've read it, at the end of the first chapter, there's a kind of skipping ahead in time that happens. We see Linda as an adult at the end of that first chapter, tracking down Mr. Grierson, the teacher. And that was in the initial story. And I say that only because it was a moment as a writer that kind of opened the book up for me. I realized that I wanted to write a book that moved through a whole life and didn't just position the narration in this moment in childhood, essentially, or adolescence. And that was really fun. I mean, there's something really difficult about writing in a nonlinear way, right? I was never quite sure what would come next, and I was always kind of feeling that out. I would write a scene and try to get a sense for what would happen next, and I didn't have an outline, I didn't have a clear sense before I wrote it, what would happen next. But I wanted to follow the voice to kind of get at how this person would tell this story as an adult looking back on a few important events when she was a kid, some events that really changed her life. And the cool thing about that for me as a writer was that it really opened up this gap in the narration, right? We have this teenager who doesn't know what's going to happen and is kind of watching it all play out. And of course the narrator at 37 knows what's going to happen, and it feels inevitable to that narrator because it did already happen, but of course it's not inevitable, it never was. And so there's this narrative tension between those two voices in the book, potentially. At least I hope.
Yeah, I think definitely there is, and there were a lot of student questions about that as well. When you open a book where you reveal so much right away, like the fact that Paul has died, but it also raises questions when you look at, say, the first chapter, like what was their relationship between Linda and Paul, and how exactly did he die? When you're writing, is maintaining that tension always at the front of your mind and during the revision process?
The narrative tension.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, so I've come to think of plotting as essentially trying to answer the question, when do you reveal what, right? So how do you make that decision? In this book, I decided to just get to say right away that Paul has died, to kind of drop that as an anchor for the whole narration early in the book so that we could move away from it, actually. And hopefully the idea is that you might even forget about it a little bit as a reader, so that you might feel what the young Linda feels, and not the older one, which is that, you don't really know what's going to happen, even though you do, right? It actually, you've been told. And then partway through the book, I decided to say, how he dies. This is the Duluth chapter. So we find out how he dies. And then the questions, once you say that he dies, and then you say how he dies, then that opens up the second part of the book to get at other questions, like what does it all mean? Could it have been avoided? What are the ethical ramifications? What should have happened? What could have happened?
Yeah, the book raises a lot of questions about responsibility and guilt, and who really should, if someone should be punished, who should be punished. And so I'd like to kind of jump, because I think it's connected. It is the situation between Lily and Mr. Grierson, and ultimately you have two trials in this book. So there are a lot of really interesting parallels. And so we have the trial between of Patra and Leo, where they're acquitted, and then we have the trial of Mr. Grierson, where he spends time in jail, despite the fact that he says he's innocent. And so there were so many questions from students wanting to know what's the truth about the relationship between Lily and Mr. Grierson, and why is it left somewhat open to interpretation?
Yeah. So this is one of the challenges of a first-person narrator, right? We only get what Linda says about it. It was important to me that we have Lily, I think it's in the second chapter. She essentially comes up to Linda, and Linda guesses that maybe, or says to her, you made this story up about Mr. Grierson, and Lily says yes. And so in my mind, at least as a writer, then we take that and move from there. The complicated thing about those questions, I think they're really good ones, is that nobody really knows, except for the characters who are not telling the story. We only get the ways that they tell their stories, right? Mr. Grierson tells his story one way, and Lily tells her stories in other ways, and tells different stories to different people in the book at different times. And that's what we get. We're left with that, and we have to sort of sort that out. And that's what Linda, our narrator, gets, and has to sort through that a little bit. The gray area that I wanted to think about is this. Mr. Grierson does have child pornography. It is, that's a fact, right? So whatever happened between him and Lily, and according to him and according to Lily, at least in what they're saying, nothing did. That means that that in fact, what we're left with is potentially Lily's ability to perceive that there's something happening in his head, right? That he had these kinds of thoughts. And not just that, but Lily is just like Linda, poor and powerless and teenage girl, and everybody's always telling stories about her. She's highly sexualized in this book, right? She has nothing going for her, and the only thing she can do is kind of turn people's ideas about her against them for her own benefit. So she finds a way to do that. She gets out of this town by telling the story about Mr. Grierson, however much of it may or may not be true. And this is something that Linda both kind of admires in Lily, her ability to take charge of the stories that are being told and use them. But she also resents and she's angry about those stories. And because that's the same kind of thing that's happening in lots of parts of her life. People telling stories about other people to get things that they want or to do things that they believe. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And one student question that I wanted to read here was about Mr. Grierson. She wrote, as an author, was it hard to write and centralize a character like Mr. Grierson who had predatory behavior toward girls?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. Was it hard to write about him? It wasn't hard to write about him. What was hard to do is to humanize him, to make him complicated, right? Like all people are. And what was even harder than that, actually, was to write about the gardeners. So to write about people who are decent in most ways, doing something quite terrible that has a terrible effect. So actually, it's easy to write about bad people if we know that, if everybody agrees that they're bad. It's hard to write about bad people, also sometimes doing decent things, being a good teacher, reaching out to Linda, right? It is hard to see that that's actually potentially complicated.
Right, because in so many ways the gardeners are initially good parents.
Right,
They're
exactly.
loving and caring and very doting on Paul, where we see kind of the opposite side with Linda's parents being a little bit removed and feeling like the best thing you can do for a child is give her independence.
Yeah,
Right, so
yeah.
were you thinking about, you have three young people in this novel, Lily, Linda, and Paul, and were you kind of consciously thinking about the different ways that they're in peril?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I think that's the heart of the book on some level. The book is about storytelling in the sense that it's about how, who's in charge of getting to say what happens, what's true, what's real. And of course, children often don't get to to say. And so, yeah, there's a lot of neglect in this book that's happening. There's a lot of well-intentioned neglect, right? I think that's easy to say, well, this child didn't get fed, or didn't get enough care. But actually, even Linda, her parents had this kind of idealistic set of beliefs, and that sent them to the North Woods to create this commune, and they really wanted a better world. They really wanted something better than the worlds that they grew up in. And in some ways, that's very similar to what the Gardeners are about. They love their child. They want the best for him. They want it so badly that they refuse to see anything wrong in him, for different reasons, Leo and Patra. And so, yeah, I would call it well-intentioned neglect, which is still as dangerous and perilous for these children as anything else.
And I love the way you would flash back to when Linda was younger, and there's that moment when she and her friend are out on the road, and the semis are whizzing by and honking, and it's such a dangerous moment, but yet even then the adults don't come after them. They send another teen, and then later in the book you have the moment where the dogs come home on the road, and Linda kind of gets chastised by her mother, like, oh, they could have been hit by a truck. And so you realize that, fate could have gone a different way for Linda, too.
Yeah. Oh, I love that you brought up that parallel. It's something that not many readers have picked up on, so that's lovely to hear. But yeah, it's easy to be, I think, to judge the Gardeners for what happens to Paul. But at some fundamental level, I think Linda is left out on her own so much, not just by her parents, but really by almost everyone in her life. At the end, she kind of wanders through town looking for anyone to tell, to talk about Paul too, and there's really no one. She can't really come up with anyone, any adult to speak to. And the question that I kind of wanted to ask is, well, if there had been anyone that she could speak to, then maybe she could have helped Paul. But there's this sort of layering of neglect and isolation in the book.
I was hoping we could talk a little bit about the ending, and then we'll open it up for questions from the audience. We had a lot of questions about the ending and the way that, sometimes we as readers look for that neat little bow where everything's wrapped up and solved. And although a lot of our questions get answered, there's still a lot of questions remaining. And would you read from the ending of the book, maybe the last paragraph or so? One student question had been about that last line where she says, I'm the one wanted more than anyone else.
Okay, so here's just the last paragraph. And then there's this. Even now, when those words move through my mind, like a curse or a wish, I become Lily. It happens just like that. I have to go through all the preparations for it to work. I have to heat the coffee, fill the thermos, wipe down the wet canoe seats with my sleeve. I have to paddle through the rolling water for a long time and do it silently and let Lily ride silently in the front. I have to be patient. I have to do all the steps. But by the time the shore is a huge ring of horizon around us, by the time I've taken her paddle and seen the look of recognition on her face, I find I'm the one stranded in the boat. I'm the one shivering with cold. I feel everything, and I'm the one wanted more than anyone else.
It's such a powerful moment. And I think we still see Linda then so alone and longing for love. Could you talk about that last line, the intent of, I'm the one wanted more than anyone else? Is that how she saw Lily, as being the one wanted?
Yeah, at some level. I think she's interpreting Lily in that sense, but it's kind of limited sense. So this is a weird moment, right? She's written this letter ventriloquizing Mr. Pearson. She plans to take it on the first day of school and give it to Lily, kind of calling Lily out on her story. And she wants to give it to her, and she's angry, and this anger actually, I sort of it comes out of all that's happened in her life with the Gardner family.
You have that moment where you write, the violence in me is almost overwhelming.
Yeah. So this chapter I wrote after I sort of finished the trial and sort of went through the effects of that. It felt like there was something emotionally that was not quite done, not quite finished. I wanted some more resolution, and what was left for me is anger. At the end of this book, this isn't an angry. She's angry at what happened to the Gardners, what happened to Paul, and what they did to him, and what they did to her, actually as well, involving her in this way, and then kind of abandoning her. And so, but all she has left is this school to go back to, and this other person, Lily, and her anger gets kind of transferred over to Lily at that point. But then she sees Lily come out of the truck, and Lily's pregnant, and it just throws her off, and she doesn't hand over the letter that she's written. And so all we're left with is this fantasy, and the fantasy plays out through the rest of her life, imagining what if she had done what she had planned, taken the canoe out and given the letter. And in a fantasy, nothing's fixed, right? So she's the predator in this moment. She's in the place of Mr. Grierson. She's imagining herself as the one pursuing Lily, but in the course of that fantasy also becomes the person who's been pursued or has been looked at, whose attention has been garnered through the book. And so there's something about wanting to be wanted, wanting to be seen in that last line, and the kind of conflation of predator and prey in that last moment in her mind, wanting to have both, wanting to be the one reaching out and wanting to be the one being reached for, even if that's in an act of violence.
All right, we're going to open it up for questions from the audience. So we have a faculty member on each side of the theater with a microphone. So we'll ask that you raise your hand, and then one of them will come to you, and we'll ask that you speak into the microphone so that our video recorder can pick it up and we can be sure that we hear you. So go ahead and raise your hand if you have a question. Okay.
I might be loud enough, but I don't know if I need the mic.
We'll maybe have you speak into the mic just so the recorder can pick it up too. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, can you hear me? Okay, no, it's without the microphone. Should I speak louder?
Go ahead and speak into it.
Okay, is it working?
I can hear you.
Okay, perfect.
Go right ahead.
Thank you so much for being here today. It is just amazing to have you, like being in Anna's class. Anna Hill, she's a teacher for college writing and pre-co reading. So I'm glad you came here because as a student, using the book and meeting the author, it's just a blessing. Thank you.
Thank you.
So
You're reading here and reading the book?
it's amazing. Now, a question I have for you is, why are you young? Why don't you just follow the same pattern that all authors follow?
Great question. It would have been easier for me too as a writer, I think, if I had just kind of moved forward in time chronologically. Good question, thanks. Why? I think I just have a sense, the more I think about stories and the ways in which I understand my own life and my own mind when it's trying to tell a story about my own life, it rarely kind of starts when I was a child and moves to now, right? I think of one thing and it makes me think of another. I think of one thing and it makes me not want to think about something, so I move away from that thing. And that kind of hopscotching through time is just my own experience of how I understand my own life and my own storytelling in general. Right? So for me, chronology actually doesn't even make that much sense. It's so rare that one thing happens and another thing, and all of those things are relevant and meaningful in a way that that brings out the thing that you want to be brought out or the point that you want to make. But also just in terms of like, you know, narrators or individuals, in my mind, we get stuck on things, we go back to things over and over again, right? So there's a kind of circling quality in this book, like a return to these moments in the cabin. But even as there's that return, my experience too is that we often avoid really digging in and thinking hard about the things that are most painful. So for me, it made sense in this book to kind of circle back, but also to kind of avoid, right? Look away as well at the same time, because it's so painful for Linda to think about this kid dying in this room in the house where she was and doing nothing. So it affects everything, and she can never get away from it, these moments in her life, this summer in her life, and yet it's really hard for her to look at it directly. And so that's why. I mean, honestly, it would have been an easier book to write if I had just started at the beginning and marched through time. And I'm writing another book now, and I keep thinking I should just do that, right? It would be easier. But it just doesn't make sense to me in terms of how I understand the way that the way that we understand our own lives.
Other questions? And while they're getting to them, I'll follow up and can you tell us, does the new book have any similar themes?
Yeah, I'm not going to talk too much about it because we're in the middle of that book, but yes, it essentially takes the voice of a father whose wife has committed suicide and he's trying to raise his young daughter. And so dark, also about a family situation. Somehow I want to write about climate change too, and that's been the harder piece to bring in. But yeah, I'm very much interested in questions about how do we raise children, how do we do so in a way that it doesn't just pass on the things that we've inherited, and how do we learn from them? How do we learn from children?
I have a question, just about the reasoning, behind in the book when you state Paul's death, what he died from, and then you go back in time to the root, the point of the root, and you go back to the I was kind of wondering the reasoning behind not as much focusing on Paul's death itself, and kind of shifting the focus to where, there it goes. Shifting the focus to more of Patra's relationship with Linda, or Linda's relationship with Patra, instead of actually focusing on Paul's death. I think it kind of just dances around the idea the whole time. So I was just wondering that.
Yeah, that's a great question. And it goes back to what I was saying a little bit before about avoiding what's really painful on some level. But I don't think you're wrong in sensing that kind of at the heart of this book is the relationship that Linda has to Patra. That's where her heart lies. She's always watching Patra. She very much wants Patra's attention. And so one of the things I was thinking about as I was writing it is this terrible thing happens. This awful thing happens to this kid. And it would be easy to write, or not easy, it's tempting to write about that in really dramatic language. Because it is really dramatic. And yet that's not how Linda experienced it, right? It felt so quiet. Because nobody was acting as if he was dying when he was. So the question for me became how do I write about this terrible thing that's happening that reveals how Linda experienced it? Which was not as a really awful, dramatic, intense thing. She only really understood what was happening later, many years later, maybe and then as it was happening, when she's wandering around town, she begins to get a sense that this is something bad is happening to this kid. When she goes in to play the game with Paul, and she sees that one eye looking at it, she's starting to get a sense that something really bad is happening to this child, but it's so muffled, and when she looks around, nobody else seems to be reacting as if this is happening. And so I wanted to give the reader that sense that she's this sort of disjuncture, right, between the events and the reactions that are happening around her. And also, as you said, I think that your point is a really good one. The person she's looking to gauge that is Patra. And the betrayal that I think she feels at heart is Patra's betrayal of her in the end when they go to the courthouse and they have that back and forth in the courthouse, in the parking lot. She wants to be seen, and Patra essentially ends up blaming Linda for what happened and dismissing her. So yeah, this for me at least, this was always a bit of a love story at heart. Linda's desire to be seen and taken seriously by Patra, and ultimately she's rejected. Good question. Thank you.
Our students?
Okay, so my question is, what is the meaning behind Linda's sexuality? Her behavior seems like, in a sense, like wild, and so why is it significant to the story?
Her sexuality?
Yes.
Yeah, so she's a teenage kid. She's trying to figure out, what desire is, what bodies are, what they do, what hers wants to do. And she doesn't have a strong sense of categories, I would say, right? And so that's why she clearly is drawn to all kinds of characters in the book. Actually, I would say she's certainly drawn to Lily. She's drawn to Patra for sure, but for lots of complicated reasons, right? And that's one of the things I wanted to just spend some time in this book is just the murkiness of sexuality and the murkiness of desire. I think she sees Patra at some level as a kind of mother figure because her mother is so absent and she wants a mother. She wants to be taken care of. But she also is attracted to Patra, I would say, as well, right? She's a young woman. She's just 26, and that's there too. And those things are not distinct, I think, in the way that Linda thinks of herself. That the desire to have a mother and the desire to have a romantic other, another person who sees her body and her mind.
Since you said you wrote the first chapter earlier as a short story, there is a plethora of topics you could have chosen for Paul's passing. Why the religious angle? Any particular reason? And what research led you to that?
Yeah, so I spent a long time in my life, a good portion of my young adult life with Christian Scientists. I went to a little Christian Science university for a couple of years, and so I knew a lot about Christian Science. I left that world and those people when I was young, but I knew that I wanted to write about Christian Science at some point. I never really figured out how to do it. And so it was personal, actually. I researched. The funny thing is, I'm not from northern Minnesota. I had to think hard and read books about, what fish she might be catching, but I didn't have to do a lot of research when it came to the Christian Science portions because I had spent a lot of time among Christian scientists. And there were cases like this that I knew of, I was aware of. This is not any one, but an amalgamation of several. And there was certainly a moment in my life, probably, when I sat and thought, if I spent more time with Christian scientists, what could happen to me, to my own children? And so that way it came out of not so much research, but my own experience.
What has the reaction been from the Christian Science community, the people that you used to know? Have they read the book?
I think so. I'm aware of some responses. Nobody's reached out to me. I have some old friends who were Christian scientists and no longer are, who reached out to me and said how much the book has meant to them. And yeah, certainly when I was writing the book, I had a lot of fear about that, about being kind of exposed in this way, and also I never meant for the book to be an expose of Christian Science, and I wanted to think about it in very complicated and complex terms, but it is certainly something that I think some Christian scientists could read and feel quite angry about. And I'm aware of that. I haven't had anyone reach out and say anything.
But yet you portray the parents as incredibly loving people, right, who really value their family as well. So
Yeah.
you're giving a nice, round, complex characters to those people in the book.
Yeah, and I think one of the reasons I wanted to draw these parallels, several different kinds of parallels in the book, was to sort of suggest that this is not just Christian scientists who have well-intentioned beliefs about their children and try to do right by their children and end up doing wrong. That doesn't excuse the effects, but it happens not just to Christian scientists, but certainly to Linda's parents and for Linda as well. And Lily.
We have time for a couple more questions.
So why specifically incorporate pedophilia instead of like something like domestic abuse or divorce or something? Like why that instead of, I'm just wondering.
Yeah, that's a great question. That's a hard question to answer. So initially, when I was writing the first chapter that initially was a short story that became the first chapter, I was in a workshop at the University of Southern California, and we had been assigned a couple books to read, and I think it was by sheer coincidence that we were assigned these two books about older male professors, both were professors, and their attraction to their younger female students. And so that was a trope that was in my mind when I began this book, and I was just annoyed with it and bored with it, and kind of wanted to push back against it, and that's where the story came from on some level. I wanted to think about this girl who has not actually been transformed into a sexual object. She's just watching that happen with her teacher and the other female students, in particular Lily, but she's watching how it works, and the weirdnesses of it and the uglinesses of it, and also the kind of power transfers that happen through the course of that. And so that's where it came from, honestly, that first bit. And I was thinking a lot in this book about power, and the ways in which certain people are given positions of power and hold positions of power, and the ways others are not, and also the ways in which others who are not, kids, children, girls, teenage girls, occasionally push back against those more fixed structures, and call the adults to task for the ways in which they wield power. That's a good question. Thank you.
One last question.
Is it?
Hi. In the first chapter, you wrote about Mr. Adler's death. I was more or less wondering if you had experienced that in your personal life, just because I would say I kind of have too with my father. And kind of give a little backstory, like I remember when my dad, he had a Charlie horse, hit his head against the wall, he passed out. I was like 9. And I remember that feeling like I would say Linda felt, where she just stood there and then felt obligated to just go up to him, but then just all she could do was just watch him. And I remember when that happened to my dad, the first thing I thought of was like, just call my mom. I didn't know what else to do. I knew about 911, but I just wanted to know if you had experienced that.
Oh, I'm sorry to hear about your dad. That is really, really hard. And yes, nobody's asked me that before, but that actually did happen when I was teaching. I was another instructor at a little university, and a student came running down the hall and said a teacher, while teaching, had passed out and fallen in the middle of giving a class. And so a lot of that scene, although I was not a child, I was an adult at the time, a lot of that scene absolutely came out of my direct experience. And so, and it doesn't surprise me, given that you have had that similar experience, that you were able to feel that, because nobody else has asked that question before. But yeah, that piece of it was from my own life. And it was a peculiar and painful and excruciating moment, to sense and feel in the room this kind of fear of this body, and this also desire to go forward, that I felt, and having no ability to help this man, to just be there, just to be there while he died. It was pretty moving and awful, and it stayed with me.
Yeah, I think so. The thing I think that got me the most on that was the person asked, like after the paramedics started leaving, they were like, why aren't the sirens on? And that's where like I started crying, thinking I feel like Linda took that on herself, saying I could have done something. And that's how I felt when I was younger. Like, what if I did call the police? Like with my dad, I didn't know his stage of condition, and what if he did die that day because I didn't call the police?
Oh, that's really hard. And I think in that way, the reason I wanted to open with that is it becomes another parallel way to think about what happens later in the book with Linda and the death of Paul.
And I think you do establish her as a strong character in that moment, because the Boy Scouts and everyone is standing back, not doing anything, and she's the person who goes forward and kneels down and takes his hand.
Yeah, and I actually did want to kind of create a little bit of a contrast, because in the end, she's really not. She's the only one who will look at Mr. Adler, and take and approach him. In the end, because she's so deeply kind of enmeshed in the world of the gardeners, because she so much wants to preserve that little bubble of happiness that she's found with them, she actually does look away and doesn't approach Paul at the end, and she doesn't look him in the eye even that much as the way that she did at the beginning. And so drawing a bit of a contrast. There's a kind of parallelism that happens, but also a contrast that happens with those two deaths that she witnesses. Yeah.
Thank you all so much. I have a couple of announcements here. Emily Friedland will stay and sign books right outside in the lobby, so if you brought your book and you'd like a signature, please do line up. There's a table set up out there. We also, because it's our 20-year celebration, we have free cookies out there, so take one as you go. And attendance certificates at the door if you need them. Please come back for the second event at 2 o'clock today. We'll have different questions, and please help me thank Emily Friedland for being here today.
So, greetings and welcome to the Fall 2019 Two Rivers Reading Series event at Anoka Ramsey Coon Rapids. This is our 20th anniversary of our reading series this year. So we are celebrating that today. And in keeping with this fall season of gratitude and giving, I would like to take this opportunity to thank all of the faculty and staff who have helped us with this reading series over the years. And I'm just going to name several of the honored faculty, and some of you may be here, some of you may not be, but if you are, would you please stand so we could recognize you? Patty Wheeler-Andrews, Kay Kaiser, Paige Reel, Steve Bestie up front there, Chris McCarthy, Tracy Youngbloom Turner, and several others that I know are not here: Scott Stanky, Melody Hyde, Katie Rauch, Linda Marvell, Patrick Shaw, and Scott Roble, who can't be here today. But would you please give our faculty a round of applause for all the work that they've done organizing this event. Thank you. Also, we'd like to thank the theater department for helping us to organize the venue here today. Peter LeRoll, Blaine Lemke, and also Rich from Facilities helping us get all of the microphones and everything situated. So we appreciate your work. Now, I have the privilege of introducing you to our visiting author, Emily Friedland. Friedland brings us her debut novel, History of Wolves, which is a gripping coming-of-age story that takes place in northern Minnesota. History of Wolves won the American Academy of Arts and Letters Sue Kaufman Prize for First Fiction and the Great Lakes Colleges Association New Writers Award. It was also a finalist for the Man Booker Prize for Fiction, the Penn Robert W. Bingham Prize for Debut Fiction, and the International Dublin Literary Award. Please join me in welcoming to the stage Emily Friedland.
Hello, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here this afternoon and to see all the faces out there under the bright lights. And thank you for inviting me to this 20th anniversary event. It's a real pleasure to be back in Minnesota. And from here, I haven't lived here for a while. It's always a joy to come back. I never get to come back in November, and here I am. So it's a great joy. Thank you. I'm going to read a little bit from History of Wolves, my first novel. And I thought I would read a passage, just a few pages, from about the middle of the book. If you haven't read the book, it takes the voice of an adult woman looking back on a few events in her life when she was a teenager, events that affected her deeply. And I'm not revealing too much, I think, in saying that we find out that this is a book about a death, a couple deaths, actually. But Linda becomes a babysitter for a little boy, Paul. She watches over him, and we learn in the first couple pages of the book that he has died. And so she's looking back on the events that led to that death. But I always thought of this book as much about love as it was about death. And I wanted to read a passage that kind of gets at that, at least for me, as a writer. And that's in the middle of the book. Linda, our narrator, is watching over a Paul while the mother, Patra, has gone to pick up the father, Leo, from the airport. And Linda has made a little tent, has put a tent up inside this cabin, and is there with Paul waiting for the mother, Patra, to come home. At 8, Patra was still gone, so we crawled in the tent we'd set up on the rug and zipped the fly. Shoes off, I said. Check. Hatchet by your head for defense? He touched the wooden handle of the hatchet. Yep. He made a ball of his body in his sleeping bag, tucked his leather glove up under his head, and then, like a stone tossed in water, sank straight into sleep. I lay down on the other side of the tent. It was very warm and quiet in there. It had an underground feeling. I meant to stay awake until Patra and the husband came back, but the tent inside the house muffled all the regular night sounds, so I couldn't hear the crickets or the owls or anything. All I heard was Paul's breath against the nylon, a very hushed sound. And I heard the black cat leaping off the windowsill, bell jingling across the room. Sometime later, a few minutes, a few hours, I heard Patra whispering. She was on her knees, halfway in the tent, hanging over us. She was a shadow and a scent, not much more than that, jacket drooping from her haunches. "Everything okay?" she asked. "He's fine," I said. She crawled in on her hands and knees and kissed Paul's cheek, then, sighing, lay down between us. Her jacket smelled of fast food and wet woods. She must have come quickly from the car because I could hear her heart pounding and then, little by little, settling down, getting back into its routine. Though maybe it was mine I heard, maybe I'd woken up afraid of something. "Cozy," she said. "So much better than being alone in a car for 5 hours, or sitting in an airport parking lot." I turned toward her. "Where is he?" She released a big breath. Delayed, then canceled. Petra hadn't zipped up the tent fly, so I crawled over and did that for her, lay back. When I did, I could feel Petra's dry hair against my ear on the pillow. I could smell the cool woods in her hair, even over the scent of her coconut shampoo. She was still wearing her jacket, and every time she shifted, I could hear it, the synthetic fibers crunching under her weight. "I should take him to bed," she whispered. "Okay," I said. She didn't move. She lay so still, even her jacket was quiet. "I'm exhausted," she whimpered. As she spoke, her voice did a U-turn in the dark. It drove right from exhaustion into despair, right off some invisible bridge between us. I didn't wonder what made her sound like that. I didn't have to guess what upset her. "He's really okay," I said. She began to cry. She was breathing, and then it was something else. She put her palm over her mouth, trying, unsuccessfully, to stop up the sound. "Sorry," she might have said between breaths, or "for God's sake," or "stay here." "Hey," I said after a moment. "No shoes in the tent." So I crawled to her feet and plucked open the buckle on her little ankle boot. I slipped my fingers in and felt the bony knob of her heel, hot and damp in my hands, in her sock. Then I slipped the bootlet off, reached over, and undid the other. Her feet and her socks seemed so vulnerable to me, so ridiculously small. I set her heels down next to each other, and the crying stopped. I heard it turn back into regular breathing. Before I lay back, before I pulled up my sleeping bag, I checked the hatchet out of habit. The wooden handle under my fingers was like a promise fulfilled. I knew, before touching it, everything there was to know about it, which made me confident and glad. Later, when I woke up, I found Petra had curled up around Paul, back to me. But I could feel her curved spine through her jacket when I pushed in closer, all those little vertebrae linked up, all those bones laid out like a secret. The night had come down hard, finally. Thunder was rumbling far away. Wind had kicked up waves, and they were loud enough now that I could hear them on the shore of the lake, shoving pebbles forward and back. I could hear pine needles whipping the roof of the house. I could hear Petra and Paul breathing in syncopation. Happy. I was happy. I barely recognized the feeling. So who could blame me for wishing that the husband's rescheduled plane would drift into a low-lying thunderhead, that it would shunt in sudden turbulence, lose elevation fast? Who could blame me for hoping his pilot would be young and scared, that he'd turn around and fly back over the ocean? The husband had his own baby stars to watch over, and his own mountain to do it from in Hawaii. I longed for straight-line winds between him and me, for hurricanes off the California coast, downpours and lightning. The thunder was getting louder now. I felt the tent I'd built gather us in, Paul and Petra, Petra and me. I slept and woke. I dreamed of the dogs. I dreamed of taking Petra and Paul out on the canoe, currents like underwater hands thrusting the boat around, so we had to fight to go forward, my paddle guiding us toward shore, or maybe guiding us away from it. Maybe we were leaving after all. I slept and woke, slept. Eventually, just just after dawn, I heard scuffling outside. It sounded like a slow-moving mammal, a possum or a raccoon, unsettling the driveway stones. Then I heard a car door thump. Very gently, I sat up and pulled the hatchet from under Paul's pillow. I unzipped the tent, tiptoed across the braided rugs, crept to the front window. There, in the driveway, in the early morning light, stood a man in a blue slicker next to a rental car. He held a brown sack of groceries, a duffel bag. He looked bland and harmless. So when he opened the door, I let the hatchet hang in my hand where he could see it. And Patra was right. I could hear him think. I could hear him taking in the dark room and the tent on the floor and the tall, scrawny kid coming out from the shadows with a good-sized weapon. I'll stop there. Thank you. So we're switching mics now, I think. Hopefully that'll work. Can you hear me?
You're good.
Yeah.
Can you hear me? There we
Yep.
go. All right, thank you all for being here today, and I want to also thank, oops, can you hear me? There we go. I want to also thank all of the students who submitted questions for this event, and that's where our questions for Emily Friedland come from today, are all the students and faculty who read the book in their courses and wanted to get some answers to their burning questions, so thank you for being here. I love that moment that you just read, that you opened with, where we have this kind of beautiful, lovely moment in the tent between Patra and Paul and Linda, and then this ominous arrival of the husband. And you had mentioned that you see this as a love story. And I was hoping you could talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I think at the very heart of this book, there's something about desire and longing, and that's what drives this character, this teenage girl, and then truly it also drives her as an adult on some level too. This longing to be with someone who sees her, this longing to be seen. And to be a part of something. I think one of the reasons Linda's drawn into this family that moves in across the lake is she sort of feels like she's, for a moment, potentially a part of their family. She's a babysitter, but she also gets to have dinner with them and spend time at night with them. She goes on a trip with them. So this longing is at the heart of the book. But I'd also say she sort of falls in love with Patra on some level. She has a crush on Patra on some level. Patra is just 26, she's 15, Paul is 4, so Linda kind of sits right there in between their two ages. She's both child and adult. And sometimes she sees Linda as a mother, the mother that she might have wanted. She's envious of Patra's attention paid towards Paul. And sometimes she sees her as an equal, as someone that she would want to be with. So that's the way in which I saw it as a love story.
And thinking about Linda as that teen and trying to kind of find herself, we had a lot of students ask about the many names that Linda has, Maddie and Linda, and all the nicknames like Kami and Freak, and even her mother calling her a new pot of rice.
Right, yeah.
And so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that, and did you mean for that to kind of reflect the nature of being a teenager and striving to find your way?
Yeah, for sure. One of the funny things about writing a book is that you spend a lot of time with the character. In this case, it's a first-person narrator, right? So I'm writing as I create this character, and then at some point you go out into the world and you have to talk about her. And I always find it strange, a little bit strange, to say the name Linda. I don't even know. I like to ask readers, like, in your head, what are you calling her? Is she Maddie? Is she Linda? Is she Madeline? Usually it's Linda, but it might not be anything. For me as a writer, she was an I. And the different names sort of reflected how different people in her life understood her. And so yes, on some level, I think teenagers are always kind of trying to figure out their identity. In the beginning of the book, there's a lot about, the Karens, the cheerleaders, the hockey players. There's these cliques, these groups, and she doesn't really fit in any of those. There's a moment in which Mr. Grierson calls her Maddie, and she feels sort of called out, like named in this way. And so I always find it interesting when some readers call her Maddie, because it's a name that maybe she would choose for herself. Right. But even her initial name, Madeline, she wonders at the end, she lives in this commune and people have all put in names in a hat essentially, and she's wondering who chose the name Madeline? Who wanted that name for me? As part of her questions about her own parents and who her parents are. And are her parents, the people she calls mom and dad, actually her genetic parents, who she doesn't know? And so even that name, she can't quite identify with. So yeah, a lot of it is about just struggling to figure out what the identity of, what her identity is and how to name her. What is her name for herself, and how do other people understand her in different contexts.
And she still seems to be searching even at the end of the novel. Even when we see her, we jump forward and we see her in her 20s and then we see her in her 30s. And she doesn't have a lot of answers, and she also still seems to be really struggling with the guilt that she carries about Paul and her inaction. And so some students had asked, will she ever come out of that? It seems like she doesn't have a lot of change from the beginning of the novel to the end.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. So this book, after I wrote it, was called a coming-of-age story. I don't know if I thought of it in those terms when I was writing it. Probably not. I think you're right. If you're reading it as not so much growing up and learning things and coming to epiphanies about anything, this is not that book. It's not a book about a kind of progress narrative. It's a book about change happens to some extent. She becomes more aware of certain things about herself and her own past, but she's not necessarily in a better place at the end of the book than she was at the beginning, and that was intentional. Yeah, that was intentional. I wanted to think about how people grow without necessarily growing up in a kind of progress sense.
So she wasn't able to move through that really critical crisis moment in her teen years and doesn't learn how to cope with it as an adult even.
I think you could say that on some level, although the one piece that in my mind at least always kind of works against that way of thinking of the book is I was thinking a lot about responsibility in this book, and of course she sort of fails to take responsibility for Paul at kind of a crucial moment, and that's a lot of why she feels this guilt in her life. But at the end, when she's left Loose River and she's gone to the Twin Cities and she's living a different life, her mother is in crisis and needs some help. And I actually sort of think you can see that move back to Loose River at the end of the book as failure to progress or really leave home. She comes back, and yet I always think about it as sort of it's return with difference, right? She comes back, and in some way she's actually taking responsibility for this mother who she's had a really fraught relationship with, and she doesn't even know this woman is her biological mother, and yet she decides to take care of her mother at the end. And so there's a kind of taking responsibility, and that was important to me. It kind of works against all the other moments in her life when she failed to take responsibility.
And some of those scenes with her mother are hard, I think, hard to read when you see just how they struggle to even communicate.
Yeah.
So one student question was, what was the hardest scene in the book for you to write?
So there's a moment when, what's the hardest moment? So the moment that I found difficult every time I went back to it is in fact the moment that's pointed out, I think, in that question, which is in the courthouse after, while Linda's thinking about what she'll say on the stand, she goes out into the parking lot, and she runs into Patra, right? And they have this kind of back and forth, and it's a really tense moment. I always found it excruciating to go back to. I wrote it, and then every time I read it, it would just get to me again, kind of, when I had to go back and, in the process of writing a book, you have to revisit the pages over and over again, and I found that moment just painful every time I went back to it, partially because it felt like a moment in which Linda's really ready to defend Patra. She's going to say that she did everything she could for Paul. She was a good mother. But Patra, in her grief and her sadness and her own struggle, lashes out against Linda at that moment and kind of essentially blames her. You thought he was sick. You're the one with your own brain, your own thinking that made him so, in this kind of way of thinking it within the religious ideology that she was struggling with. So she blames Linda, and Linda feels betrayed, and when her moment comes on the stand, she doesn't defend Patra.
I think it's a really intense moment to read in the book, and even though it's hard, it's one of my favorite scenes because you just sense her hope as she comes to Patra. And she's just really hopeful that Patra will give her that reassurance that she needs, but she doesn't get it. And I love the way that throughout the book you just raise a lot of questions about responsibility, guilt, neglect. I'm wondering, as a writer, are you cognizant of that as you're writing, or are you just telling the story and then during revision you start to think about those things?
That's a hard question. A good one, though, a really good one. So I feel like one of the great joys of writing forward and getting a little bit, even just a little bit under your belt as a writer, like let's say you get 30 pages in, 100 pages in, is that the patterns start to appear to you that you didn't know, and you didn't even intentionally include, right, or weave in. And then you can see kind of that work that's happening sort of almost subconsciously as you're writing, and then consciously bring it forward a little bit more, and consciously let it lead you to the next pages as you continue to write, and then ultimately in a revision to go back and kind of pull those strands to the surface a little bit more, right? So these themes about guilt and action and thought and betrayal and all these sorts of things, neglect. I began to feel those patterns coming out as I was writing, and then I could do more with it. So I always struggle with the first 20 pages of any new piece, right? You just don't know what it is that you're even doing. And it's a great joy when you get something, on the page actually that tells you, that teaches you what it is that you're writing.
So we have a lot of aspiring creative writers in the audience, most likely. So what kind of advice would you give to them then if they're experiencing that fear about starting or any sort of writer's block? And also they're very interested in how long it took you to write this book and your process of publication.
Yeah, so you're asking me at a time I'm kind of in the thick of writing another novel, and it's so funny because you think you write a book and I forget how hard it was to write it, and then I'm away from it for a few years and I think, oh, that was not so bad. Now I'm in the thick of another book and it's really hard. It's really hard daily to do the work and understand what you're doing, and partially it's because there's so many choices in the beginning. And the beauty, this is sort of what I mean, as you write further along, the choices narrow, and the story itself sort of allows you, sort of suggests to you the path that would make the most sense. But when you start, the book could be about hundreds of thousands of things potentially, and through the course of writing, those choices narrow a little bit. In terms of just writer's block, I don't have any tricks. I wish I did. It would be, everyone wants that. I want that. I'm looking for those tricks. If you guys have them, let me know. What I always tell my students is try to see the work in a way that defamiliarizes it or makes it seem different from whatever it is that's starting to feel dead, or whatever it is, whatever wall you're hitting up against. And that might mean, I'm a big fan of just especially putting away your computer and getting a pen and a paper and writing by hand, writing really loosely, allowing yourself to feel like you're sketching, lowering your own expectations for yourself. But I also have done weird things like read whole portions out loud into my phone and then listen back to them so that it no longer feels like the pages that are fixed when I'm writing them on the computer, but I can hear them, I can hear the music of them, and I'll take notes while I'm listening, and that will sort of lead to new ideas and new thoughts. And there's a whole slew of things. I mean, even just like getting it and going to a new room, leaving the house, going for a walk. Always a walk, like always. If you're struggling, go for a walk. I love the idea. I've been thinking about this of planting some little seed of your thinking related to a project. So like I'll read a scene maybe, and then do something really different, like read creative nonfiction or poetry, or go for a walk in a place I've never gone to before. And whatever that little seed it is that I planted earlier in the day, often I'll find that I'm working on it without even intentionally working on it. When I look away just a little bit, I look at something else. And so these are little tricks that I use, but I'm always open to more tricks. If you have them, I would love to hear.
So what would you say, how long did it take you to write and revise and then go through the publication process?
So this book, I began it as a short story, and so I wrote that in the first maybe 15 pages and finished that and put that away for a while. The novel itself, when I decided to go back to that piece and start working on it in a kind of more intentional way to create a longer work, I did that. I dropped in pretty quickly. I had the great luck and privilege of working with a teacher, Amy Bender, who's also a writer at the University of Southern California. She's great. If you haven't met her work, I highly recommend it, Amy Bender. But she offered to read some pages every week for a period when I was a student. And I thought, well, I'm going to take advantage of this opportunity. So I wrote the vast majority of the first draft of this book within those couple months that she agreed to look at pages, and I just kind of wrote forward. So she'd read pages, and then I wouldn't, of course, go back. I would want to keep writing forward, and that was a really good way to do early drafts. So that first draft was a couple months, maybe 3 months, 4 months at most. And then it took probably 2 years of returning to the book and lengthening it and seeing those patterns that we were talking about and really bringing to the surface some of the things that were resonating to me as a writer in terms of what I wanted to do and I wanted the reader to feel. And then I finished a draft, so that was like, 2012 to 14. And then I submitted it to an agent, and then she held on to it for a while, but I did a few little changes, and then maybe over the course of a few months or a year, but I wasn't working on it that whole time. I was just, she was kind of holding on to it, and then I submitted it to my publisher, and there was a round of revisions there, and then a second round of revisions, and then edits, and then proofs. And every time, you're going back, and the changes are getting smaller and smaller. But it really was 2012 to 2017 when it was published that that whole process happened. I was working on a lot of other things at the time. I was teaching, I was doing other things, but that was the period. Yeah.
Revision is key.
Revision, yeah. And I would say, the funny thing about this book, I've been shocked when I've gone back and looked at my early notebooks, my handwritten notebooks, how close some of the paragraphs are in this final version to those original drafts. Because it felt like I was going back over this material over and over again, and I realized part of that going back, I was making some changes that I think were really essential, but not that obvious, maybe. And also some of that work was just saying no to editors. I don't think that's a change that I feel comfortable making. So although I wasn't actually changing anything, there was a kind of rethinking of the material.
So I have one last question that I'm going to ask, and then we're going to go out to the audience. So if your question hasn't been asked yet, or you've thought of one while we've been talking, you'll just raise your hand, and we're going to have 2 people along each side with a microphone, and they'll bring you the microphone so you can talk right into it, so it will get recorded in our video recording. So I would be remiss if I didn't ask about the title, because we had many students ask about the title of the book. Now it is obviously Linda's project, right, is the history of wolves. Was that the title of the short story? And how do you see the title relating to the rest of the book beyond Linda's project?
Yeah, great question. It's one of the questions I get asked most often, I will say. And it's always funny to get it. I get this question from people who haven't read the book, and they're really like hoping it's about like a real history of wolves. And I have to warn you, if you haven't read it, there's not a lot of wolves in this book, not actual wolves. So I always point back to the first chapter in which Linda does her project, and particularly to a scene when she stands up at a podium and she's giving her wolf project, her wolf presentation, and she's quoting from Barry Lopez, who's a wonderful writer about wolves, and he has a real history of wolves out there, which if you haven't read and you love wolves, please go read it. But she quotes him saying essentially something to the effect of, an alpha wolf is only alpha at a specific time for a particular reason. I'm misquoting him now, actually, but something to that effect. And he, and what was important to me, at least in that moment, is that as a teenage girl, I always felt like she's drawn to this project and to wolves because of this potential that they offer in her mind for power shifts, for power to the dynamic, the hierarchies that she's been given through her whole life of parents and child and teacher and student and male and female, that those fixed hierarchies of power might not be the only way to think about the way that power works. That wolves, at least in this quote, in this moment from Barry Lopez, is suggesting that power might shift based on the context that you're in. That's really compelling to this kid who has very little power in her life. And so that's why she's initially drawn to the Wolf Project. And so I was thinking a lot in this book about that, about these kind of shifts in power that happen, about who has power. But also, wolves are just a resonant image, right? So once I had that title, I knew that there was the potential to think about wolves in the context of the lone wolf, of the pack, of wildness, of all sorts of things, of violence, of predator and prey. And all of these sort of themes are in the book in some ways. So it just felt like once I had that title, and she kind of gave me that title, I thought, okay, that can work for this book. The funny little story about it is that when I published the short story, it didn't have that title initially. It was called From Living, which is not a great title, as it turns out. And I submitted it to a literary magazine with that title, and it was rejected. And then I changed the title to History of Wolves, and I submitted it. And when I was going through my records, I didn't really realize, because the story was initially categorized under this old title, that I was actually resubmitting the story to the same journal that rejected it, right? So I submitted it again a second time with this new title, and they accepted it, and they actually gave it an award. And so I just like to tell that story for those writers out there who are like, I'm getting rejected. Sometimes, this story only goes to show how arbitrary I think in some level a lot of publication is. But also that sometimes maybe the title matters a little bit too.
Okay, thank you. All right, let's take some questions from the audience. So if you have a question, please raise your hand, and we'll have one of our faculty bring you the microphone.
I was just wondering, something that our class focused on a lot and we were really confuzzled about was the order of the paragraphs within the chapters and how they seemed kind of disjointed from each other. And one of the things that I did when I was reading a lot was trying to find the connection between the two events from two different paragraphs and seeing how they tried to relate to each other. And I had some difficulty sometimes. I was just wondering if that was intentional or if there was connections that you were always able to make, and if you wrote it that way in the first place, or if you wrote it in a line and then broke it up.
Yeah, thanks for that question. I'm sorry if it was a difficult reading experience for you. So I'll answer your second question first. I actually did write a lot of this in the order that it came out, not all of it. And more of the beginning part of the book. The second part of the book actually moves around in time a lot more, and there's a little more tinkering that I did with that in revision. But a lot of the first, maybe the first portion of the book, I wrote in that way that I just said. I was writing pages every week and just moving forward. So I would write the paragraphs in the order that you have them, more or less. Many of the first pages, many of the first pages in the first half of the book, if not more. And I was thinking as I wrote about what felt right. I always think about plotting in terms of the micro and the macro rhythm. So the macro rhythm, right, is like what scene leads to what scene, what chapter leads to what chapter. What are the rhythms? When do I slow down as a writer and like luxuriate and look around and describe a scene? When do I speed up and do something in a more compressed way? And that feels like a tempo or a rhythm that I'm just kind of listening for as a writer. But it's really intimately related to me to the sentence rhythms. So I'm also listening, sort of, I'll write a sentence and I'll kind of feel out what feels right for the next one. And so the ultimate book then comes out of this trying to modulate the macro rhythms, right? Like where are we going to go next in her life, and where are we going to go in this town and on these lakes, and also like where are we going to go? How much am I going to reveal? How much are we going to learn about these characters? How much am I going to withhold? All of those rhythms I'm trying to match with just what are the sentence rhythms, right? Like, okay, I'd have editors say to me, like, you should change this because it doesn't, I'd rather have it, have this piece of information revealed at a different time. And I would say, but I can't change the sentence, right? Because somehow that was very important in figuring out to me what came next. And I just trusted that. I also believe in trusting the reader too, and giving a lot of credit to them and saying, okay, you guys, these two things are set side by side. I'm not telling you how they're related. It's worth, what are you coming up with? I'm curious. A lot of the connections are emotional, I would say, rather than chronological, certainly, but also don't offer transitions, like, and the next day, those kinds of narrative transitions. And I like to see what readers come up with in the white space between pieces.
Another question?
Okay, so I just wanted to ask why you use fictional town names like Loose River, but still used like Duluth and the Twin Cities.
Great question. I like this question a lot. Especially talking to Minnesotans, right? Most of the time when I'm talking about this book and other places, the question of the actual names and the locations doesn't come up, but I like talking about that a lot. So this is a book that I essentially invented in terms of the setting and the location, right? I mean, I made up this little town and its surrounding lakes, and I made a little map, and it was fun for me to draw and kind of figure out the fictional world that Linda lives in. But then I kind of like pasted on to the real world on some level. So it's in northern Minnesota, but they drive to Duluth, right? I mean, she goes down to the Twin Cities at some point. I was writing a first book. I don't know if I would do it this way again. I will say that. But what was really interesting to me, and has been interesting to me, is that people who live in those locations, up in northern Minnesota, in Duluth, they can see better than anyone else where the fiction and the reality, and you guys, some of you might be from those regions, right? You can see like the stitching, right? The fantasy, the made-up parts, and the real parts are, they're just stitched together. And some of that work I do better than others, I think. But it happens for all of us. All fiction has that kind of that boundary of stitching where you come up against it. And so for my dad was interested in fishing I was worried that my cousins and my brother, who's a fisher person, that the stitching that they would see is like, oh, where Emily got the fish wrong, right? Like how you catch a fish, right? Like I don't fish, right? So that's the stitching that they were looking at. Others, like figure skaters, might look at the moments talking about figure skating and look for that stitching, that stitch work. I'm very interested in this as a writer. How much do we take from the world? How do we compost it or rethink about it and rebuild with those materials? And then what's there when we finish? I'm not answering your questions, I'm just kind of going on. The question is, why did I make it fictional? I'm not from northern Minnesota, and I wanted to invent. And I think one of the reasons I write fiction in general is that there's a kind of freedom that's allowed. If I say to you it's fiction, I can distance myself a little bit from it, and I can play and I can invent, and I need to do that sometimes to get at emotional truths that might be harder for me if I were trying to remain absolutely true to the specifics of the real world. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Another question? Two down here.
Hi, I'm wondering how much research do you do for parts of it, and then when are you doing that? Is it before you're writing, during, or combination?
Yeah, good question. I have a fraught relationship to research. I really like to do it. It's really fun to Google things and get books and yet I find if I do it too early in the process, it does kind of put a damper on the way that my mind is, kind of that freedom that I'm talking about, the ability to follow sentences and the emotional reality where it will and not worry as much. So it's important, I think it's really important to get some of these details right so that the stitching doesn't show quite so obviously when you do kind of try to stitch together your fictional world and the real world. So it's important to do, but I like to wait at least until some of the writing is done, so that early drafting can, there's so many reasons not to write, and one of them is I don't know enough, right? So giving yourself the freedom to write when you're not sure if you know enough. First, get a draft out or get some writing out, and then go back. That seems really important to me, at least as a writer. It kind of loosens up the writing. But I did eventually do some research.
I think there were a couple of questions in the middle here. And I think we have time for maybe 2 more questions, and then we'll have to wrap up.
Is there any connection between the book and your own life?
Yes, and no. I'll say that, no. It's one of those questions that writers often get, and of course, yes. I mean, I can only write about, I only have the materials to draw from my own life, right? My own emotional reality, my own reading, my own experience in the Northwoods. So yeah, it comes from my life. But the vast majority of the plot has very little to do with anything that I have ever experienced. I did not watch a child die in this way. I did not grow up in a commune in Northwoods. So yeah, a lot of the major details, major plot points, I should even say, were not related to my life. But there are definitely specific moments that come from my experience, and probably more broadly, just a way of thinking that comes from my own experience. Yeah.
Last question?
I can get it. So I noticed that there's 2 parts of the book. It's science and then health, and I was just wondering how more it connects to the book besides that Leo's book that's what it's called.
So initially, I knew that at some point I was going to have two sections of the book. I just could kind of feel that happening. And what really divided the two sections in my mind as a writer was that at the end of the first section, the narrator, Linda, reveals how Paul dies. They're in Duluth, but she kind of, at that point, says, this is how he dies. And then we watched that play out in the second half of the book. But the information itself kind of opened a door for me. And I always thought of the first half of the book as kind of, although we have bits of her adult life in the first half of the book, I always thought of the first half of the book being more aligned with Linda as a teenager. We're kind of following her and watching things happen, but we don't totally know. I was hoping that the reader wouldn't totally know what was happening, how things kind of added up. It's more about observation. The second half of the book is more about interpretation. More of that part of the book, for me at least as a writer, felt aligned with the adult looking back. And the adult looking back knows what has happened and can kind of make a diagnosis, or is more capable of interpreting and making a diagnosis, taking the facts of the circumstance and adding them together to say what happened. So that was part of the reason why I divided the book in that way. And those two ideas of kind of like observation and diagnosis are kind of looking at things, but not entirely interpreting them yet. Seem to align with those two words in my head, science and health. So science kind of taking in information, and health being the interpretation at the moment of diagnosis, potentially. That's how I thought of it. But I also just wanted to have those words there as kind of little hints to a reader in the know about kind of what the sort of bigger themes about religion would ultimately offer. Does that make sense?
Thank you so much. Please join me in thanking Emily Friedland for being our guest writer this semester.